So you're all very welcome. Just to remind you that this session is being recorded. My name is Professor Louise Ryan, and I am Director of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre. And I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Maria Lopez, who is co-director of the Centre. So we're going to be here throughout today's session. We are delighted to have a very interesting session today, and this is part of our seminar series that we run here at the Centre. We have seminars on a sort of fortnightly basis, roughly on a fortnightly basis, and please do check out the Centre website for details about other seminars. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off today's event, which is entitled Exodus from New Turkey, Turkish Intelligentsia in Exile. And we've got two very esteemed speakers here today. I'll start off with our visiting external speaker, who's Dr. Bahar Basser, who joined Durham University School of Governance and International Affairs in 2021. So she's a new appointment at the University of Durham. So congratulations on that, Bahar, where she's associate professor. She was previously an associate professor at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. She's an expert on diaspora studies, peace building and conflict transformation, with a particular focus on the region of the Middle East. And she's the editor of the Kurdish Studies series published by Lexington Books. And she's co-editor of Diasporas and Transnationalism series published by Edinburgh University Press. And she's also a Senior Associate Research Fellow at the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa, in South Africa, and visiting professor at Tampere Peace Research Institute in Finland. So a very esteemed colleague. Before I hand over to Bahar, I will introduce somebody who has the great honour of being her husband. I'm going to put it like that, Urdi, rather than the other way around. And this is our colleague from London Met and a very active member of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, whom you may have heard speak before. So that's Dr. Ahmed Urdi Ozturk, usually Urdi to us, where he's an associate professor and a Marie Curie fellow here at London Metropolitan University, and also with an association to Coventry University. And he's an associate researcher at ELIAMEP, which is a leading research centre in part of their Turkish programme. He's co-editor also at Edinburgh University Press series on modern Turkey and editor of International Journal of Religion. And he was a Swedish Institute pre- and postdoc fellow at the Institute in Sweden. And he's also scholar in residence at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies. And he's the author of more than 25 peer-reviewed journal articles and numerous reports. And as I said, he's a very active member of our research centre. So it's wonderful to welcome Urdi back to the centre, but especially our external speaker, Bahar. So Bahar is going to speak for about 30 minutes. I could please ask colleagues to make sure that your microphones and cameras are turned off. If you have questions, please type them in the chat and I will read them out at the end of Bahar's presentation. And I would ask you not to interrupt the speaker, but please hold back your questions until after she's finished speaking. So Bahar, I believe you're going to share your PowerPoint. You're very welcome to the Research Centre, and we're looking forward very much to your presentation this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this great introduction. I'll just share the PowerPoint now. All right. Can you see the PowerPoint? Is everything okay?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so happy that Arde and I get the opportunity to present our current work at the moment. So these will be our preliminary findings, and we find discussion on this topic extremely helpful for us to proceed for our book that will be published next year. So please feel free to ask any question that crosses your minds. So today we'll be talking about exodus from New Turkey, the new Turkey that was created under the AKP rule for the last decade or so. So what we are interested in is the latest migration flows from Turkey that's happening on a daily basis, actually, after every critical juncture in the country, which got accelerated from the Gezi protests onwards in 2013. So our focus today will be specifically on the Turkish Intelligentsia, and I will explain throughout the presentation what we mean by intelligentsia, because it's a very loaded term itself. But let's start with a brief background first. So I said there's a latest migration flow that started with the Gezi protests in 2013. So it's happening because of several political developments in the country, but this is not the first migration flow that's happening en masse at the moment. So since 1960s, there is a constant flow of people from different profiles, different backgrounds coming to Europe and going elsewhere beyond Europe from Turkey. So Turkey is one of the most well-known immigration countries in the world. So why we care about the latest wave? It's because for any migration scholar who work on Turkey, we divide the layers into different time periods. So we say that the first largest wave happened in the 1960s because of bilateral agreements between Turkey and different European countries such as Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Austria, etc., where people from Turkey came as guest workers. The second flow happened between 1970s and 80s because of the political turmoil in Turkey and coups and memorandums and military interferences, etc. Another wave happened in the 1990s with the intensification of the Turkish-Kurdish low-scale civil war. So what started as labor migration then turned into a different type of a diaspora formation because it became an amalgam of different waves for economic and political reasons above others, such as education. So the workers who came in the 60s came and stayed, and although initially it started as a guest program, it turned out to be a permanent experience. And then, of course, this wave brought family reunification, and it brought the families of guest workers from Turkey. So it started with 10,000s, and then it reached 100,000s, and today we are talking about a diaspora from Turkey, which is already exceeding millions, if you consider the descendants of the first generations as well. So around 1 million of these people are from Kurdish origin, but in total it's possible to talk about 5-6 million people from Turkey all around the world, and especially in Europe. So when we look at what's happening after the 70s is that every critical juncture in Turkey in terms of politics, this could be if you remember the 70s and 80s, the zeitgeist, you know, the leftist and rightist student movements, and Turkey's political nature, this intervention of the military in politics on a regular basis, we see that each critical juncture creates a new wave, and these people arrive to the shores of Europe and are dispersed from the center to the periphery. And when they come, of course, they bring a baggage with them. Sometimes it's identity, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's ethnicity, but Turkish politics also come to Europe with them, and they create organizations in Europe, and you know, they start as migrant groups, they turn into transnational communities, and then finally they form diasporas, and then they engage with their home countries and host countries, and they have these hybrid identities. So there was already a Turkish diaspora in Europe, and so the new wave started almost invisible, and we tend to, you know, start our new current research from 2013 onwards with the Gezi protest, but we believe that there were small signs of this mass exodus even before that. People started trying to find alternative ways that would be beyond Turkish borders because of their discontent with the government. But Erdi and I decided that we take Gezi protest as our milestone for this new research, because that's when people really started making plans of leaving Turkey. And after the coup attempt, many people actually realized their plans. And this is what we want to show you in today's presentation. So for any migration scholar who works on Turkish diaspora in Europe and elsewhere, the latest wave is really important because it is changing the diaspora spaces and it's changing them in a way that we cannot see now. It's a long-term project, but it's changing the profile of the diaspora. It changes the balances of power that have been created during the last 5 decades. And it's creating new alliances, new cooperations. It's creating new rivalries. So Turkey's polarizations and conflicts are imported by these latest groups, and it's also affecting the old diaspora. So that's why we find it really interesting. So in order to give you a background, so we said that the previous migration flows happened because of political developments in Turkey, but they were usually coup attempts or coups or interventions by the military or the civil war, etc. So what prepared the latest wave is a long story, actually. So I want to give you just a brief background. So we tend to identify the new migration flows happened because of the AKP rule and how it changed Turkey, transformed Turkey towards a new Turkey, as they call it. So then we need to go back to the rise and fall of AKP's Europeanization agenda. So when the AKP came to power, it actually created a new dynamic in Turkish politics because they came with a lot of promises, including, reformation towards minority issues, human rights, and also they promised that they will, stick to Turkey's attempts to become a member of the European Union. And then they also promised that, all these people who were sort of suppressed under different military interventions will finally find room to express themselves. So they promised for more freedom of association and speech when they came to power. So this has gradually changed, and we found ourselves in the new situation today. But this did not happen overnight. So for the last 20 years, we have been experiencing a transformation of Turkish politics. So when the AKP came to power, it also brought promises related to long-standing issues in Turkish politics. One of them was the Kurdish question, for example. So the AKP acknowledged that there was a Kurdish issue in Turkey. They started an initiative, what they called the Kurdish opening. So, they allowed TV stations to pop up, which would broadcast in Kurdish, for example. But of course, they would control the content. And they also started a peace process with the Kurdish movement. Of course, the meetings were secret in the beginning and happened in Oslo, but then it was leaked to the public space and people knew about it. So they created a facade of a democratization process in Turkey, and although people were skeptical in the opposition, many liberals, intellectuals, they believed in this new project. I mean, what could be worse than what Turkey had before? It was not a fully fledged democracy anyway. So any party which promised these kind of initiatives was welcome for liberals and other intellectuals in Turkey. So the peace process started at the end of 2000s, but quickly failed in 2015 for a number of reasons. But there was then afterwards a return to violence. During that time, many people felt comfortable enough to criticize the government for past atrocities towards Kurds, for example, or they felt open that they could talk about the potential peace process and truth commissions, a transitional justice period, etc. So we saw that when the peace process collapsed, many people were then persecuted for what they have done during the peace process. So many people started feeling that there will be something wrong with Turkish politics from 2015 onwards. And then we also had the constitutional referendum. So many things have changed towards benefiting the AKP government, and also by promises which they said would decrease the military tutelage, but it created unintended effects in the end. And then we also saw the AKP Gülen movement fallout, which started happening again during that time, during the fall of the peace process, for a number of reasons. So the Gülen movement in the beginning supported the AKP when they came to power, and they had an unconventional alliance. But of course, when it comes to sharing power, they had a power struggle, and then they had this fallout, and perhaps Erdi can bring in his insights on this issue later, because he works on this. But Gülen movement was really influential in many aspects of Turkish state, especially in institutions. So when the fallout started, we realized that this dispute would spill over to other political spaces in Turkey, and it did. Also, we can talk about the Gezi protests, as I said. So they happened in 2013. So it started as a protest, as a small protest by young people, but then it gradually emerged, and it became a larger protest movement in different cities in Turkey. And Gezi protest is a breaking point for many people. Many people say that after Gezi, I decided to leave Turkey, because that's the moment when people understood that the AKP government was becoming more and more authoritarian, and they had a very unproportional response to the protests, and many young people actually died due to police violence and other mobs. So this was a defining moment for many people to start considering, perhaps this is not the country I love anymore. After the peace process, as I said, the escalation of violence returned. And another important issue to mention here is that when Turkey was, experiencing this democratic decline, which means that AKP becoming more and more powerful, and the more they are powerful, they cling to power more, and then they don't want to let it go. And after the peace process, we saw that the securitization policies came back, and this militaristic discourse was dominant in many politicians' speeches. And when the PKK turned its war towards an urban fight in southeastern Turkey, the state also reacted by a harsh military response. And there were some serious human rights violations around that time, and many academics came together and signed a petition which was called Academics for Peace Declaration. And this created an uproar among the government circles, and of course by the president. And at that time, we saw that many academics were dismissed from their roles, and many universities ended contracts with academics who were already in precarious situations. So and also these people were put on trial for terrorism charges. So we saw that the space that was given for freedom of thought and freedom of assembly was actually shrinking very rapidly after 2015 onwards. And then right after this Academic for Peace Declaration and the uproar towards it happened, we then, of course, experienced the coup attempt in Turkey. So it is believed that it was the Gülen movement who organized this coup attempt. Perhaps they had other collaborators, but we still don't know up to this day who organized it and why and how it happened. But the state officials, of course, reacted it with emergency declarations all around the country, and then the purge started. Many people call this the purge because with lots of emergency decrees, people were dismissed from their work, people were put in prison. Basically, it was a great opportunity for the AKP government to cleanse all state institutions and important media outlets, universities, institutions, etc., from the dissidents of any kind. So Of course, the Gulen movement was the main target, but any people who belong to different groups who were in the opposition were also cleansed from the system. And then we can talk about another milestone for people who decided to leave Turkey was Turkey's regime change. So from a parliamentarian system, it turned to a presidential system, and of course, this disappointed many, either who belong to the leftist-leaning camp or the Kemalist camp. So this was kind of the last straw for many. So if you look at current politics, we see that AKP's dominance can be challenged, and this was a surprise to many. So they lost the local elections in Ankara and Istanbul. So İmamoğlu and Yavaş came to power these municipalities at the local level. So this kind of created hopes for many. So they said perhaps we should stay and observe what's happening in Turkey. But still, our research actually shows that many people are planning to leave, and people we interviewed showed us signs that they have been planning these for years. So that what we will present today is the tip of the iceberg, and there are many others who are actually planning to leave. And finally, if you're following the news, the economic crisis happened, and I mean, Turkey's on the news for the last 3-4 days because Turkish lira lost lots of value, and there were protests even last night in Istanbul and Ankara about the economic crisis that Turkey is facing today. So obviously, these new developments will also create new migration waves. So after this quick background, then we can talk about the exodus. So what do we mean by this? The exodus is such a loaded word. So when we talk about people leaving en masse, I mean, if you look at world politics, we should be talking about Syrians or like Iraqi Kurds who are stuck in the border between Belarus and Poland. But what we present in our work is that Turkish migration is somehow invisible in the statistics, yet it's very important, and the numbers are rising immensely. And we call it an exodus because people are leaving, and our studies actually show that they don't want to return, at least for the short term. So this is a migration that will affect European social spaces as well in the next decades, and they will be the potential new citizens of many European countries. And we find it very important to analyze as well, because as I said in the beginning, the new wave is really changing the balances of power in the diaspora, and because Turkey is now also engaging actively with its diaspora organizations, the rivalries are really present. Polarizations are carried over to the transnational space. So our aim is to understand who is coming, who is leaving, with what motivations, and finally, what's the role of the Turkish intelligentsia in all this. When we talk about brain drain, we also see large numbers of Turkish intellectuals are leaving Turkey. So we will look at their purposes in a minute, but let me give you the general picture now. So who is leaving and where are they going? I don't know why it shows this way, but okay. So current statistics show that under this gloomy political atmosphere in Turkey, many Turkish citizens, primarily the members of the Gülen movement, as well as secular Turks, Kurds, and Alevis, are fleeing or migrating to Greece, mostly as a transit destination, and after Greece, they move to other European countries. So some people are applying for asylum, while others are buying property to obtain residence permits via the golden visa systems available in Europe. So our research has shown that people find a way to leave, and sometimes the reason is political, but the route they choose can be, disguised as an economic migrant or an asylum seeker or somebody who obtains a golden visa. But the main motives are always political, one way or another. So authorities underlined that up until 2015, the applicants were mostly from Kurdish origin. But after 2015, the recent trend shows that the profile of the applicants are usually non-Kurdish, actually. And this explains the flow of Gülen movement members to Europe. So the number of Turkish citizens who are granted protection status in European Union member countries rose by 300% between just 2016 and 2017. And about 1/3 of these applications were ultimately successful, so they actually managed to stay in Europe. And we looked at Lampas's studies, for example. He argues recognition rates vary significantly among European countries. So Norway holds the highest rate of recognition with 89.7%. But by contrast, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria have yet to reach a positive decision. So it takes really long time to apply for asylum in these countries. And that's why many people are trying to come to the north, especially to Germany, and then to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And Greece has a rate of recognition of 54%. So asylum applications from Turkish citizens raised by 9% in 2009. If you look at recent statistics, and Turks became the 6th largest group seeking asylum in Europe. I mean, considering what's happening in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and other places, placing Turkey to the 6th position is really important. In 2020, the trend continued. Turkey was ranked this time the 5th. And we see that from the statistics, more than 50% of those who flee Turkey prefer Germany as their main destination. And asylum applications from Turkish citizens have multiplied in the recent years. So in this report, it is stated that there were more than 10,000 applications to Germany in 2018 alone, and this trend continued in 2019 and 2020. For example, this number was only about 1,800 between the Gezi protests and 2015. So this is a remarkable increase. This shows that after the coup attempt, many people actually acted on their migration decisions. And in 2019, Turkish asylum seekers constituted the 3rd largest group within Germany after Syrians and Iraqis. So Greece is the transit destination. So there's a lot of research conducted in Greece about people who are fleeing Turkey. So when it comes to Greece, it's reported that until 2018, there has been a 1,300% increase in asylum applications from Turkey. So Greece has been a transit destination, as I said, so many smugglers are familiar with how to cross the Evros River, and it's remarkable how people easily meet smugglers and get support with their migration decision to pass the border illegally. So apart from asylum applications in various countries in Europe, the United Kingdom is another popular destination for entrepreneurs and white-collar workers. Up until very recently, the Ankara Agreement Scheme, so it's the Turkish business person visa, has become more attractive. So in 2018, for example, there was a 6,000% increase in Ankara Agreement applications. Statistics show that more than 20,000 Turkish entrepreneurs have applied for work visas in the UK. So as I said, this is also, for example, this makes us believe that many people are, coming here for economic purposes to invest in businesses. But in reality, our research actually shows that people are fleeing for political reasons. But if they have the means to apply for this visa scheme, they do that. So there are many Turkish intellectuals who use the scheme. Also students, also people who had pending trials in Turkey found this as a solution to have a quick visa. So if you invest in some money and if you pay taxes for the intended amount, then you can actually prolong your residence, etc. So many people come here and open businesses with that. For golden visas, the preferred destinations are Portugal, Greece, and Malta. This is valid for Turkish intellectuals, but also many businessmen and many people who had these financial means. This was also an escape point, at least a plan B. So what happens is that you invest in Portugal or Greece with an amount of 250,000 euros to 300,000 euros. You buy a property and then you're given a residency, at least for a short period, which has the potential to be prolonged. So many people use this as plan B. But this time, if we look at this, so we have asylum seekers who belong to the Gulen movement, we have academics, we have intellectuals, journalists, artists, we have people who were, nurses, diplomats, teachers in Turkey, and who had to flee in under very hard conditions. But we also have white collars who applied for jobs and come to European countries in different ways. So the profiles are different. There is a large migration flow, but it is represented by many different people from many different walks of life, ideologically, religiously, and if in terms of ethnic background as well. So this is very interesting to study. Today we want to focus more on the intellectuals who came to Europe, and we want to focus on their experience. So by the intelligentsia, by the intellectuals, we are aware that this is a loaded term, and we know very well that this might be challenged, so about our selection of our sample, etc. But we chose people who had public profiles, who had a public audience, who had an impact on public opinion. For example, people who wrote columns in newspapers, people who were presenting programs on TV, academics who wrote impactful books, etc. So when we talked about intelligentsia, we talked to people from different walks of life, but who had an intellectual audience in Turkey and who were kind of well known by Turkish people. Here we find it really important to talk about the methodology. So we are basically combining forces with Ardi for this project. Ardi's project is funded by his Marie Curie project, by the European Union, and I work for a project which is funded by Academy of Finland and led by Elise Ferron. My project looks at host countries' reactions to importation of conflicts from home countries, and Ardi is specifically focusing on transnational authoritarianism and the new Turkey's new diasporas in UK and Germany. So we conducted different interviews for this. We mostly used snowball sampling, and we have so far 55 interviews, 20 of them we will be using for the book, but also Ardi has quantitative data for his forthcoming books and articles. He had conducted around 500 interviews in each location, so he can reflect on that in the Q&A session. I think for both of us, this was one of the hardest research projects ever, because we realized that people were not feeling comfortable when they talked about their experience in exile. They still had fears that the interviews might leak somewhere and they can be prosecuted in Turkey. Even the data company that worked for Ardi's project had these kind of problems. Nobody wanted to talk, nobody wanted to tell us how they really felt about Turkish politics, etc. So it was really hard to convince people to start with. And for the part about intellectuals, they allowed us to use their names because they are public figures, so we are doing. For other interviews we conducted with lay people, we actually anonymized all the interviews. For another reason, it was really hard for us because the polarization in Turkey, even in these people you might call dissidents of the regime, it was incredible. And many people were asking us, for example, so are you interviewing Gülenists? If you are talking to Gülenists, I don't want to give you an interview. So Kemalists would not want to be involved in the project if we were interviewing Gülenists as well. And I mean, there were these kind of frictions, even like on personal basis. So if you're interviewing this person, I'm not going to talk to you. We realized that reconciliation will be really hard, even if there is a post-AKP period in Turkey afterwards, because even when you're conducting research, people did not want to see their names in the same document with these people, and how we were thinking how we can actually bring these people to have a dialogue and to build a new Turkey after this. And we found the fieldwork of the project really challenging, so I think it needs to be mentioned. So just a quick note then on how Turkey is perceiving this latest migration flows and how it's reacting to a new diaspora formation in Europe, especially by the intellectuals. So Ardi and I, we published on this before, and we found that Turkey is actually differentiating its diaspora as good and bad, and it has formed different policies. And which we can call positive and negative engagement. So the dissidents who are coming to the diaspora, they are immediately listed as bad diasporas who are not, you know, pursuing Turkish interests in the diaspora, but who are damaging the Turkey brand. So we see that they have to deal with a lot of internet trolls, etc. But also they constantly feel insecure, even if they cross the border and come to somewhere else. And their engagement with the Turkish state also is very conflictual in a way, or tense when it comes to, you know, dealing with the consulates, etc. So we also underline that Turkey is applying this newly coined term, transnational authoritarianism, to its dissident populations abroad. Of course, it's not as severe as other countries like China, etc., but it is there. So what's happening is like the repression tools that Turkey uses within the country can also be transnationalized and may follow people although they leave the country. I mean, this could be, for example, you know, in the example part I mentioned, you condemn them to civil death, so by canceling passports, by preventing exit, and then if you can exit, then preventing voice. It's creating a sphere of repression for those who leave. People think, what if I need to go back somehow? I should be careful about what I'm saying, what I'm doing, etc. And people see that when they come to the diaspora, they see that there's actually a massive diaspora segment which supports the current government, and they join election rallies and demonstrations of power. So people are really feeling tense when it comes to, you know, being active in the diaspora groups as well. And of course, also Turkey is using Interpol and denouncing a lot of people as terrorists and criminals, and it's making extradition demands to many countries like Germany, Austria, Netherlands, etc. And after Russia and China, Turkey became one of the countries which sends the highest number of requests to Interpol. And if you remember, there were also cases where, you know, European countries started investigations about spying imams in countries, Germany and Austria. So they said people were actually, you know, the imams and people who work for the Turkish state keep blacklists of people who are dissidents, who are not. And this also created a sphere of insecurity. There are also other issues with gangs and militant organizations which were allegedly supported by the government. This was in the news in Germany and Denmark, for example, especially about a couple of boxing clubs where Turkish nationalist young people threatened dissidents in the diaspora, etc. So there is this intimidation and fear. But our interviews actually shown that many people mentioned that there is intimidation and fear, but they were also asking how much of it is real, because usually it's all rumors. So Turkey managed to create a rumor, a transnational rumor, that it's following its dissidents abroad, and people are doing a lot of self-censorship, or they are fearing for their lives, but people really do not know whether there is this transnational network or institutions which follow you every day with what you're doing. So at least it created a facade like that, which creates mistrust, etc. So when we interviewed people, in general, we found feelings of hopelessness and despair among some of them. But we also found feelings of resilience and struggle and survival in some of them. So this did not matter. This did not depend on ideology. So, for example, within leftist circles, we have noticed lots of hopelessness and disappointment, but also we found resilience as well. So every relationship that they form in the host country, every feeling was personal. So we did not find generalizable results about that. We found that our interviewees' relationship with exile was really complex. So some of them said that they felt in exile, but because some of them had pending trials and they couldn't go back, otherwise they will be in jail. So they definitely define themselves in exile, while others said, I can go, but I don't prefer to go, so I'm semi-exile. And they came up with different concepts to define their situation: voluntary exile, semi-exile, self-exile, etc. And we will show you their own narratives in a minute. And you can see that people interpret the situation differently. We found mistrust was always there, especially people who were active in politics in Turkey and who, for example, struggled against the Gülenist interventions before the fallout with the AKP, etc., they had this constant mistrust towards the Gülen movement members, be it their intellectuals or lay people. And the fear, I already talked about that. So even for intellectuals, there was a choice to make. So when they go abroad, do they want to stay silent and stay invisible for a while, or do they want to just be active in the diaspora as well and try to influence politics from afar? So we found that some of them made different choices, and their choices depended on age, family situations. You know, sometimes they didn't want to create worse situations for their families at home, so they decided to take a step back from Turkish affairs. While some others, it just became a duty, a responsibility, and they became more active in the diaspora to insert influence into discussions. But for some, it was really satisfactory, but for others, their experience in the host country also brought different question marks in their minds because they were disappointed with their experience in the host country as well, and we will come to that. So we found conflict and cooperation among different dissident groups, but we also found that new fault lines are being created among different intellectual organizations in the diaspora because of the current experiences after their exodus, or because of ancient hatreds between different groups which existed already for a long time. So we observed tensions among the new diaspora, but also we observed tensions between the old and new diasporas for a number of reasons. So the old diaspora, which is referred to as old diaspora, were usually the labor migrants who came from in the 60s and their descendants, and the newcomers believe that most of them support the AKP, so they wanted to put a distance. But at the same time, the old diasporans who also worked for democratization of Turkey were really disappointed when the new wave came and did not collaborate with them and started creating their own agendas, etc. So now I just want to show you some of our findings, and then I want to show you their own narratives. So we selected a couple of quotes from the interviews we made so that you can hear their own voice. But just a bit of reflection. So we noticed that when the intellectuals made their choice about migration, most of them actually had connections here and there. They had short or long-term plans to live abroad for a while, especially academics. You know, they wanted to come for exchanges, just to as one of them put it, just to breathe a little bit outside Turkey and feel normal and then come back. But some of them had to flee really out of necessity. So for some, for example, people like Engin Sustam and Can Dundar, it was usually the trials that were against them, and the lawyer said, you need to leave now, otherwise you might not do it in the future. So people went for a touristic trip somewhere and then they couldn't come back. So it was we couldn't generalize it. So the second part, the second thing we found also, many of our interviewees had previous experiences of exile. They also left the country in the 80s, for example, after the military coup, when they were young students, young university students, etc. People like Yavuz Baydar or Barbaros Shansal also talked about these experiences. So they were used to leaving Turkey for political purposes, but some people did not have this experience before. We found that networks matter. So destination depended on existence of previous networks and opportunities. So for example, many people, although they could go to a country, let's say in Italy or Spain, they preferred Germany because they thought that they would have better protection there. For others, it was the job opportunity. So scholars at risk or or different journalist associations offered scholarships in those countries and they went there. So relations with host countries also depended on motivations and agendas of different actors. So some of them, for example, had really good relations with MPs and the civil society organizations in the host countries that they migrated to, and then they found a familiar atmosphere when they went there. For others, they just went wherever they could find a job, and their isolation became a traumatic experience in the end. I mean, many people who went to smaller cities, for example, mentioned that. And then we asked them about return, but we found that return is a really loaded concept for many. And many of them actually do not want to think about it so much at the moment. But in diaspora cities, it's very common that people say, I'll return when the time is right. And many people said, you know, we might return when the time is right. And this right time was different for everybody we talked to. And we do not think that they had fully fledged plans about return yet. So I think many people are there to stay. So now I just want to show you quotes from our interviews with Turkish Intelligentsia, and I will reflect on our findings in the meantime. So when we talked about the motivations to leave, you know, why did you leave? How did you leave? Many people gave different reactions. Of course, we can't share all of them right now, but we try to choose different ones just to show you how colorful the sample was. So, for example, Barbaros Shansal, who is one of the biggest names in Turkish fashion industry and who left Turkey to live in Cyprus, he said, when I look back on my performances, I performed a miracle in the desert in Turkey. But that flower can't survive in the desert. I realized that as I matured. You leave a cactus in the desert and walk away. So that was his feeling. He felt like no matter what he did in Turkey, you know, he contributed to LGBTI activism. He you know, pioneered minority rights in Turkey. But in the end, he realized if you don't have the right environment, that flower can't flourish. So he left. Another academic, Bülent Somay, who was one of the signatories of the Academics for Peace petition, he said, for example, when we asked him why you left, this is what he said: if I don't trust my students, this relationship has broken for me. Has been broken for me. The moment I began to see my students as potential informants, potential rogues, that meant that I would no longer be able to teach classes well. I decided there. So for him, when the state actually subcontracted this monitoring and surveillance role to the students, even to your neighbors, to the people that you see on the bus, then it started becoming a really a weird atmosphere for people who felt like they do not belong to this country anymore. Another interviewee who used the pseudonym Deniz, who was also a signatory of the petition and who left Turkey in 2017, he said he left off. She left after the petition because every cell in her body and in her brain wants to forget that process. I mean, she was reflecting on how she was oppressed by the university administration, but also she received a lot of threats from the local people in the small city she was teaching, and she didn't feel secure anymore, and she left. Also, a journalist, a Kurdish journalist from Turkey, said she gave birth in 2017 and she left because she gave birth to a daughter and she didn't want her to grow up in a country which is, you know, which is experiencing state violence on a daily basis, and she had her own reasons in that sense. When we come to the approaches to the idea of asylum and exile, you know, for many people, applying for asylum status was a huge psychological barrier. People actually did not want to do it. Although you would think that people are fleeing Turkey, so they want to reside in Europe, so this is an easy way. Many people actually don't feel that way. They feel like it brings trauma with it. And the situation of exile is the same. So many people do not want to define themselves as exiles because it also brings its own baggage. So for Deniz, for example, she was saying that she was happy in the country that she lives, and she said, when you taste this freedom, you know, she's not saying that the countries she has been living in are wonderful, and she says she's actually writing about racism and heteronormativity in those countries, but still she had this certain space of freedom and she doesn't want to leave it. So she's missing her friends back in the country, but she says that I'm not in that psychology of exile any longer, so I want to stay where I am after 4 years. For Barbaros Shansal, again, he was saying that many people, for example, Cem Özdemir, Sevim Dağdeviren, German politicians or MPs from other people from Die Linke or Kati Piri, who was the EU representative at that time, asked him to apply for asylum because he was severely beaten when he left an airplane in Turkey because of his criticism against Erdogan. So he was saying that he was offered European passports, but he said, I reside here with my Turkish passport. That's my hunchback. But our hunchbacks must be our gear in life. If we dismantle and try to dispose of those hunchbacks, it would be like severing the hump of a camel, and you then wouldn't be able to pass through the desert. So for him, his passport was a burden, but he wanted to live with it. So for others, for example, for academic, again, Bülent Somay, he says, I don't consider my own situation as exile. He says because he can go back to Turkey, so if he can return, so there is no pending trial against him. But at the same time, he will be unemployed, he won't find a job, so he says, I define myself as semi-exile. But he says, I can go, it's fine, but I'm never sure that they won't break down my door with a battering ram at 5:30 in the morning because of a tweet I shared. So the feeling of insecurity continues, and that's why many people are holding back now. They are waiting for a miracle to happen so that they can permanently return to Turkey, but nobody can explain when this moment will come. For Engin Sustan, for example, a Kurdish intellectual and academic, he said, when I listened to the experiences of the generation which came here after the 1980 coup, I didn't want to apply for political asylum because I didn't want to fall into the trap of victimization as an intellectual. So Engin tried to find other ways to stay in Europe, finding jobs, and finally he married to his French partner because applying for asylum had a psychological barrier for him. It would mean that he would be a victim, he would be treated as a victim, and he wanted to avoid that. So there are also other examples, but I think Can Dündar's is really interesting. So Can Dündar published an article about Turkey's intelligence institution and the arms that were being sent to some countries in the Middle East. And then, of course, he was arrested, put in prison, and he had an ongoing trial when he left the country. So he was saying that he, as a journalist, he was used to this idea. So if you're writing in Turkey as a journalist, and if you're criticizing the establishment, you go later, you go to exile, or you go to prison, or you get killed. He says this is our career plan as Turkish journalists, so I was expecting something like that. But he says that ultimately being in exile or being from Turkey under these circumstances evokes a strange feeling of responsibility and guilt. So he says if he drinks a beer in a bar in Berlin or have fun somewhere, he feels guilty because he has so many things to do for his home country, and he doesn't have time to spend on enjoying his time, actually. And he found it really cumbersome. So for others, for Şehbal Şenyurt Arınlı, again a documentary maker from Turkey, she belonged to the camp which only talked about resistance. So she said that exile is an escape, but she refuses to surrender to a dictatorial system. So she was saying that the day will come when we can from the lands that made us who we are. So we should use political exile as a venue for our struggle and extend it to different circles as well. So she had a different approach to it. So when we talk about the experiences in the host countries, Can Dündar had an interesting point, and this is echoed by many academics and other journalists whom we interviewed. They said that in the beginning they were welcome, they felt welcome in European circles, but after that they realized that their intellectual contribution was just diminished to Erdogan bashing. So they realized that they wouldn't be invited to different seminars, workshops, to talk about their own research or other interests, but they would only talk about the democratic decline in Turkey. And if they criticized the country that they were in, or if they tried to talk about world politics, then they would be pushed to that corner again. So either you talk about Erdogan and the authoritarian drift in Turkey, or you don't talk. So he was saying that they define you through your identity as a Turkish dissident, and there you go to another prison, at least ideologically. And this is a little disturbing, he was saying. After a while, you only get asked about Erdogan and Turkey, and this puts you into a tailspin eventually. It's coming to such a point that it's as if without Erdogan, you would disappear as well, as if you exist through your opposition or are allowed to play on a playground. So I think this is a very serious criticism, and it has a valid point. So academic Bülent Somay, for example, also said like he felt like he was being swept around like a broom because he was only given 6 months, 1 year, 2 year contracts here and there, but nobody was actually interested in what he was doing. But because of his age also, many departments did not want to invest in him. So he really didn't find a good audience in Europe for his intellectual mind. And for Engin, he was saying that he burdened himself with the mission of being a savior, and he's constantly spending time to influence politics in Turkey and elsewhere. But at the same time, he was feeling that this situation, he was treated as a victim.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bahar.
Yes.
I'm just conscious of time, and it's getting pretty close to 5 o'clock. So you have been speaking for almost 50 minutes, and I'm just
Okay.
keen to allow plenty of time for discussion. So perhaps if you could aim to finish within the next 5 minutes, would that be okay?
Of course, of course. So after
Yeah,
this one, I have
thank
two
you.
slides anyway, so I can go to the second slide.
Yeah, thank you.
So apart from these different experiences of exile and approaches to asylum applications, we then talked about return, whether they would return to Turkey. And as I said, they had different opinions. But people who have children, they underline that they need to stay, at least for the sake of their children, but they want to live a two-legged life. But when it comes to hope, so do these intellectuals have some hope for Turkey's future? Everybody had a different opinion. Most of them were really pessimistic. But some people like Hayko Bağdat, for example, an Armenian columnist and writer, he said that each of us are rebelling in our own space. It's not bad, by the way, Turkey's rebellion despite this oppression. So he said that we might win in the end. It won't be heaven, but the alternative is quite terrible. So people, intellectuals in the diaspora, should come together and still work towards democratization in Turkey. So to conclude, then I would say that what we did so far with Erdi, with all these research and interviews, we just scratched the surface. So more research is needed, and this topic is really ever evolving. So there are new dynamics every day, new developments in Turkey, which is affecting the diaspora spaces. But what we found out was that the domestic disputes between different intellectual groups in Turkey travel to the diasporic space, and it shape and reshape relations transnationally. We found reconciliation among different groups is a bit hard in the diaspora, and this is very telling about what might happen in Turkey in the future as well. And finally, these new waves of migration also pose challenges for host states, because they are sometimes stuck between a hard and a rock place when it comes to accommodating the dissidents in their own countries, but at the same time answering Turkey's diplomatic demands. So I stop here. Sorry, I took a little bit more time, but it was so nice to share our research findings with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Bahar. It was really fascinating, and I was intrigued because a lot of the research that I do, we guarantee anonymity to participants. So it was very interesting to hear the voices of participants who are well-known figures and who are happy to be named. So that was very different, but really interesting, particularly given the sensitivities of the research. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have two presenters who can address your questions, and I would encourage you please to type your questions in the chat. But if anybody would prefer to put their hand up and ask their questions, you can do that as well. Please use the raise hand function. Please remember that the session is being recorded, and we're aware that there are some sensitivities around this topic. So if you would prefer not to give your full name, we understand that as well. So can I open the floor for questions? Currently, there aren't any questions in the chat. So maybe while we're waiting for questions, I could start by asking a question to both of you. And maybe you could answer briefly while we're waiting for other people to start asking questions. So one of the points I was wondering is, it's clear that Europe has really closed down a lot of immigration routes. It's very difficult now to get into Europe, as we know, and as we can see from events that are going on at various border crossings around the continent. And so I'm just wondering, to what extent are people applying through the asylum route because there are so few other routes? And so is there a risk there that the narrative of asylum becomes the dominant one simply because there are no other routes that people can legally use? So I just had that thought as listening to particularly the data that you were presenting, Bahar, about the huge rise in the number of people who are coming through the asylum route.
May I, Bahar?
Of course, of course.
Well, I mean, we have been working about this topic more than 3 years, and we conducted very different kind of interviews from like intelligentsia, ordinary people, and also a survey company has been conducted interviews for us. So what we saw that, particularly regarding the Turkey-originated new diaspora members, or the migrants, as you say, there is no one single pattern. It is based on their education. It is based on their economic level. It is absolutely based on their connections, their ties, their ethnicities, their religion, communities, their relatives. There are many different kind of indicators. But for new Turkey's new migrants, what is quite interesting actually, the Turkey's transformation is not happened in one night. In every single day, there has been another critical junction has been happening. I mean, for example, yesterday, there was a devaluation in the Turkish lira, and it was a critical junction. And most probably a month ago, there was another critical junction. And since particularly roughly 2011, but after particularly 2013 Gezi protests, every single critical junction has ability to prepare some of the individuals to go beyond the borders of Turkey. So therefore, they're not using like the classical migrant discourse. They've been using different ways. Ankara Agreement is one of that. For example, that we will use this term in our upcoming article, using Trumpland countries. I mean, it was very fascinating when I heard the stories, particularly migrating from the Balkans. What I'm saying about the Trumpland countries, not using Greece, but using North Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, visa-free countries for Turkey. They like pass the border one way or another. They reach to North Macedonia. They build up a business company just for £1,000, and they got a residence permit card. And with that residence permit card, they move to Germany and declare an asylum. I mean, this is a very unique way when we compare the others. So, I mean, there is not one singular answer. Well, there's not one particular answer to your question. There's a whole chapter might be regarding your question, Louise.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat and we've got a hand up. So I'm going to ask Patrick O'Sullivan, who has typed a question in the chat. Patrick, do you want to turn your microphone on and ask your question? And then after that, I'll come to Tele, who has his hand up. Patrick? Can you hear us, Patrick? Although, if you can't, yeah, hi. No, okay, Patrick isn't responding. I don't know if you can see the question that Patrick is asking. Could you please maybe respond to the question that's written in the chat, Bahar or Erdi?
Or both. Yeah, it's a
or
quite
both, indeed.
It's a quite intellectual question actually. Does Hüzün appear, or it's just a distraction? Or the Portuguese colleagues certainly find that Saluda is a distraction. I don't know what you're going to say, Bahar, about this issue.
I would say like definitely the Portuguese understanding of Saudade was there,
Yeah.
because like huzun or sorrow, in our I think like the interviews were really hard for us because both Ardi and I experienced that the interview we cried during the interview. We had to cut several times, and we triggered emotions, and we told them, of course, we can stop anytime. But it was so hard for many people because, you know, it just, especially after 2016, after the coup attempt, it just became such a horrible period that people couldn't go back to their mothers' funerals. You know, families were separated, so people couldn't see their children for a lot of time because they were, you know, pushed to civil death situation, etc. So sorrow was definitely there, and they were missing Turkey. They were missing their previous life, but at the same time, there were so many breaking points that when we asked them, you know, where do you want to go back, they couldn't actually tell us anything, because each year there was a massacre, a bomb exploded and killed peace activists in Ankara, in Istanbul. There is this, there is that. So there was so much sorrow in Turkey as well. So they wanted to return to a different Turkey that they would create together rather than to the past. But the huzun was definitely there.
And
I
at the
think,
same
Patrick,
time,
you've
just
got
one.
your sorry, Erdi. Patrick, you've got your microphone on now. Did you want to add anything to your question?
I mean, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear you perfectly, Patrick.
No, I mean, Louise will know this, but that when we talk about Irish diaspora, we keep coming up against the word exile, and it is often offered as an explanation that does not explain anything. It's a sort of way of not explaining. And some of the critiques of the Irish use of the word exile call it simply self-indulgent Irish exile. And so I got interested in other communities and other words that work in the same way. The one that is you've picked up already, Bar, is saudade in Portuguese, which is a conversation stopper. It doesn't allow the conversation to go on anywhere. So I was looking for those words, and huzun seems to me so powerful as a conversation stopper that I wondered. I mean, and you've actually said this, Bahar, that it is a conversation stopper. It's a way of not talking about the experience, and it's such a complex word, with its connections with Sufi and so on, that I just wondered whether it was there as a, well, sometimes we want to stop the conversations, so we can use these words as a resource to stop the conversation. To saying, you know, it's unspeakable, it's intangible, it's and so on. So I was interested in, was that there as a resource, perhaps?
And also what I realized when I've been conducting interviews, there are different level of huzuns. I mean, the sadness. The first one is about the social statue. I mean, when you talk about the intellectuals, uh, I mean, I didn't want to put it like that, but I think this is the only way that I can put. One way or another, they've been feeling that their position is from hero to zero, because they had a very strong public impact factor when they were in Turkey. But now, I mean, when the streets of Kreuzberg, or maybe in the streets of London, they're not very quote unquote valuable for the people. The other thing is that they have been missing their, I mean, the normal daily life. They said that when I asked some of the elderly professors, they are in quote unquote exile, what are you gonna do when you go back to Turkey? They said, I'll go to that restaurant and I'll eat that cheese. I mean, this is something quite sad, because they are not very young to prepare a new life after Erdogan, or with the beginning of the new regime. So there are many different types of huzuns, sadness, emotions, melancholy among the intelligentsia. But on the other hand, when you conduct an interview with the new generation, like mid 30s, mid 40s, you can feel another energy, you can feel another desire to recreate their life, or to recreate the newest Turkey.
There's lots of hands and questions are going up now, so I'd like to keep things moving. So I know Tele has had his hand up for quite some time, so I'm going to ask Tele to turn his microphone on. And then after Tele, we've got El Said Mahmoud, who has a question in the chat. Tele, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for the presentation. For me, it's fascinating, because it's a number of themes emerge from your presentation. For example, I wonder whether you be framing some of the key themes within the history of dissident exiles who were who were pursued by the authorities and murdered. For example, the very famous Leon Trotsky, rather, and even within the apartheid regime, that they pursued dissidents and eliminated them. So there's that. For me, it would be really useful if you were to frame the experience within the history of dissidents throughout different period. The other is the affective aspect of it. As you alluded to, somebody feeling guilt, and for me that reminds me, in terms of my own interest, the ontological issues, the existential being of feeling guilty, where your potential has been thwarted. So their potential has been thwarted by the fact that they're to leave Turkey. It might be interesting to see whether you notice other similar similar reflections that can be couched within that hermeneutic perspective in terms of ontological issues. And the third is really, the reality is, as intelligentsias and academics, yet there is the ambivalence of when they're in Europe, the UK or Germany, in the academic world, they are in a competitive environment. The initial there's the ambivalence of sympathy, but also competition. So hence, been not been acknowledged for their contribution, because they're also seen as a threat to the established academic context they're in.
Thank you, Tele. So you've asked 3 questions there. There's lots of questions in the chat now. So perhaps I could suggest that maybe Erdi or Bahar would like to answer Tele's very intellectual and philosophical questions, and then the other one of you could start to read the many questions building up in the chat, so we can try to be fair to everybody. So who'd like to answer Tele's ontological questions?
Bahar or?
Bahar,
okay,
your husband is volunteering you for the intellectual question. And
okay,
Erdi, could you have a look at the ones in the chat, please?
Sure.
Bahar, over to you. And then I'm aware that Isabel has her hand up as well. Bahar, sorry.
Oh, great to see familiar names in the chat box as well. Very great questions. So thank you so much for this question, Tele. There are a lot of things to reflect on, but just very quickly. So in our book, we will try to have a discussion about exile in general, and then we will locate our own research within a larger framework of dissidents in exile from Turkey throughout many years. So this is not the first time this is happening, and this is not the last time. What is we asked our participants, what's different this time? When you compare yourself with the previous exiles, what's different? And many people said that there is now technology, so we are very close to Turkey now. So before you were distant and you were far, and now things are changing. So we will also reflect on these changing dynamics. But you are absolutely right. We will definitely put it in a broader framework. And when it comes to guilt, actually many people felt guilt for a number of reasons. And we noticed that there was this hierarchy of I don't know how to put it, who paid more dues in this struggle kind of way. So victim hierarchy in a way. So people were almost feeling guilty that they were not put on trial for what they did, but other people were put on trial. So they were like, maybe I shouldn't call myself an exile because there's somebody who suffered more than me. And then there was this like hierarchy of suffering in a way, which made people feel guilty. And there were other types of guilt. So I left. I had the means. I had this privilege, but I left many of my comrades behind. People who are, you know, for example, for academics for peace, etc. So I left, and I now need to do something because I survived. And if I don't do anything, then I'll be labeled as a traitor as well. So there were different kinds of feelings that were definitely there. So we'll make sure that we will reflect on these also in our introduction of the book, definitely.
Thank you very much for that very detailed answer to Tele's question. Right, Erdi.
Regarding the questions,
Yeah.
I think everyone can read the questions. So let me start with the El Said Mahmoud's question. I mean, the word of exile in Turkish says pretty much sürgün is quite difficult to define. And particularly for the intellectuals, for the public figures, we had many different kind of difficulties to get to find an interviewers when we said that we would like to talk about your exile experiences. Because, for example, one of our interviewee candidates says that, I mean, the word of exile is so hard for me. If you don't mind, I do not want to speak with it. It is emotionally very tough. The other one, for example, he has been living, I mean, more than for 5 years in abroad right now. He said, I'm not in an exile, I'm here in a voluntary position. But we know that it's a kind of an exile, but he didn't want to associate his name with an exile. So in this meaning, I mean, the exile being in a sürgün, I mean, abroad or forced migration, or finding themselves in a safe haven under the authoritarian climate of Turkey is very hard for everyone. So it was like the I mean, Patrick's question and the previous philosophical questions, this intelligentsia's diasporalization process has a big psychological background with all of these issues. The second question is to Guy. What kind of differences have you seen in experience of asylum seekers and semi-volunteer migrants? Indeed, I mean, the differences is based on legal issues, based on their life conditions. But I think the big question is, what is the similarities? The similarities is that they are quite pessimistic about the future of Turkey. They are very pessimistic about their country's current situation, and they are trying to establish a new life in a foreign country. This is the very similar stuff, and their relations with their groups, their networks in their new home countries or their host countries is quite similar. I mean, the differences are quite obvious, but the similarities is the important part within these circumstances. I mean, as Said's second question, we didn't do any particular research on some institutions, likewise University in Exile, Scholars at Risk, but most of our members, for example, Professor Bülent Somay, Dr. Engin Sustam, Dr. Nil Mutluer, they are the members of the Scholars at Risk or Academy in Exile groups or the projects, because they have been funded by these institutions, by these networks, by these collective support groups to be in their current host countries. So we are very much aware of these institutions, but our study is not directly focusing the characteristics of these institutions, these networks.
So I'll just stop you there. Sorry, Erdi,
Yeah.
I'll just stop you there because I'm aware that Isabel has had her hand up for a long time. So if I could bring Isabel in at this point to ask her question, and then maybe somebody could be looking at the chat for further questions. Isabel, over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to finally see my beautiful friends after a few years. Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, just as a Portuguese, I wanted to comment on the growing Turkish diaspora in Portugal, which is actually varied. There are Turkish Jews, Armenian Turks, also golden visa holders. So it's a very diverse community, and what I'm noticing in this Turkish diaspora in Portugal is that, as Bahar mentioned in her presentation, they are they reproduce the struggles in Turkey, and what I find interesting also is that they are themselves helping politicize the Portuguese society. For example, there are several younger Turks who are members of social movements in Portugal. So it's interesting to see how they are also helping the struggles in Portugal of several types. So yeah, just my short comment, and again, my thank you to my friends.
Thank you, Isabel. Would you like to
Thank you so much,
respond to
Isabel.
Isabel's comment?
Just one sentence is what my dear colleague Isabel said, that even it is fascinating to establish a sentence of something like that, Turkish diaspora in Portugal. I mean, we were very much used to hear that Turkish diaspora in Germany, in France, in Netherlands, even in the UK, but in Portuguese. Currently, it's a holiday destination for upper middle class Turkish people, but right now it is a destination for the Turkish diaspora. This is one of the indicators how this subject is quite important and getting quite enlarged and large in terms of the research area. So thank you so much, Isabel, for your comment.
Can I say something about?
Oh, of course you can, Bahar. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. Just thank you, Isabel, for the comment, and saudades. So I also noticed that many people are actually moving towards Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and one way for that is because they want to avoid Turkish communities in those European countries, and they try to find a safe place away from other Turkish communities as well, and Portugal presents a good opportunity for that. For the sürgün, the Turkish word for exile. So thank you so much, El Said. I'm also following your work. I know that you have a presentation coming up, etc. So I'm very happy that I found you. Well, sürgün is a loaded term, and it means different things, starting from the Ottoman times. But I found in my interviews, at least, that people use sürgün in order to differentiate themselves from the migrant, göçmen. So when they say I am in exile, even though they don't believe that they're in exile, it still gives them a privileged position, saying that somebody is intellectual who is abroad for a cause, etc. And it helps them to differentiate their status from the others. And I realize people use it for that purpose as well. So if it's an interesting finding for you.
Thank you. So I see there is another question in the chat from Yasin Duman about your use of the concept of Turkish intelligentsia. Could you address that question?
Can I go first, Arde?
Yeah, Yasin is your previous PhD student, so it's your
yes. Yeah. So Yasin, I'm really proud of you. Thank you so much for spotting that. So I actually, I mean, we wanted to find a catchy title for the presentation, and this is not the title of the book, but you're absolutely right. So once we started doing this, we were focusing only on the Turkish people like Can Dundar who fled, and the idea was to focus on them. But then, you know, there is no way to just talk about Turkish politics without including you know, other groups from Turkey with different ethnic or religious backgrounds. So we have Alawites now in our sample. We have Armenian background people, different people who represent both identities that sometimes overlap. But from the Kurdish side, we had also interviews with Hasip Kaplan and Faisal Sarıldız, but we couldn't have time to code the transcripts yet, but we will have more actually to show. So you are absolutely right, and I'm so proud of you as my former PhD student who can criticize his supervisor in public like this. So thank you so much. You're absolutely right.
And Yasin, one addition note to Bahar. It was very difficult methodologically and ethically to divide the interviews equally. I mean, when we choose, like, for example, 4 Gülenists, we are always thinking that, I mean, we are Turkish citizens holding still Turkish passports. Why we didn't choose 4 Kurds or 4 Alevis, 4 Armenians? So it was very difficult for us to reach the equal proportion, equal importance from every single group to get everyone's voices. This is the first thing. The second thing is that Turkish intelligentsia is, we know that it is not a very comprehensive concept, but actually we are very much open for every kind of suggestion regarding the title of book, because in my mind, for example, I was calling that Turkish celebrities as in diaspora, but they said no. And then Turkish intellectuals, public figures.
I said no.
We really, yeah, Bahar refused my suggestion, so I said yes to her. I mean, so it is very difficult to find a comprehensive term for that kind of diverse group, because they were former member of parliaments, they were scholars, journalists, I mean, the artists. It is so difficult to find a comprehensive term, and we are very much, we would be very happy if you can suggest any kind of like any kind of concept to comprise everything in this basket.
And
Thank you. I can well
of
imagine, yes. Yeah, there's another question in the chat. Were you going to address that, Bahar?
Yeah, Yasin had one question and then I can address that. So
Okay.
Yasin asked about intergroup relations. So
Hmm.
I would say, Yasin, it didn't depend on the ideological stance. It depended on each individual, really. For example, there were some academics for peace members who were trying to prevent Gülenists to get scholarships, etc., while there were others who were trying to create dialogue bubbles to contribute to Turkey's future, etc. So there were different people with different attitudes toward intergroup solidarity, but I would love to explore more with you when we have our findings. So another question I see is that Turkish voters abroad in the UK tend to vote more for opposition parties such as CHP and HDP, which is the case, yes. So does this influence people's decision in terms of destination? I mean, it's very hard to come to the UK if you don't have the means, mostly money, financial means, I think. So it's rather the economic circumstances that that determine. What would you say, Arde?
And in these days, I've been exploring the survey data, and one of the questions is that why did you choose that country particularly? When I checked the answers of the survey results, the scientifically significant number of people preferred their countries not regarding their diaspora's political views. Mostly survival attitude is getting quite important. Economy first, and the networks, whether they can live in these countries quite a long time or not. So they're not choosing, I mean, they don't have that luxury to evaluate the countries according to Turkish diaspora's political views.
And thank you. There's a final question in the chat. I'm just conscious of time. It's 28 minutes past, but Umar has typed a question in the chat.
Would you come?
Very briefly, I can say what I think. So I think all of this comes down to the transformation of Turkish politics one way or another, because the transformation affected economy, our social lives, etc. So I think the political reason is the main reason. But we met also a lot of people that were not part of this presentation, but they were like apolitical in Turkey. They were not included in any kind of activism or political party, but they just didn't see a future there. And this is like mostly the seculars who are concerned about Turkey, so they left. They were worried about Islamization of Turkey, etc. So there is also this secular groups who leave for other reasons. And also we found that many people said the economic instability makes it very hard for them to see a future in Turkey, because they have all these diplomas, but there is no merit. So it's a lot of nepotism and corruption. That's why they sell everything, whatever they own in Turkey, and they start a new life, mostly for economic reasons, and they are not very political in the diaspora either. So the profile is really mixed and complex, and there are overlapping interests and agendas, but I think politics was the main motive. Arde?
I mean, this is the question that we have been thinking on it quite a while, because when we make one-to-one interviews, we realize that, as Bahar says, very apolitical individuals found themselves abroad. So this brings a new, very fundamental questions in front of us, in front of the scholars. What is politics and what are the limits of politics? For example, one of our interviewees said that I'm not a political person. I'm not very much related with the politics. But you know, the security issues, the economy, the lack of freedom of thought, push me to go abroad. So this is political. So what is political and how we can define the politics? Everything within this study and with all of these migrants, whether they're the member of a political party or not, whether they're being actively involved in politics or not, it is political. And the main reason of these new Turkeys, new migrants, starting from ordinary people to the intellectuals, quote unquote, it is very much related with politics.
Well, thank you very much, Erdi and Bahar. Very nice to meet you, Bahar. I haven't met you before, but I've heard a lot about you, so it's very nice to put a face to the name. I'd like to thank all of the people who've attended today's seminar. We've had a very active, engaged audience and lots of very informed questions in the chat. So it just goes to show how engaged and interested people are in your work. And not just your former PhD students, but others as well, particularly those from the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for such a fascinating presentation and to wish you the very best with putting the final touches to your book and the final touches to your analysis. I'd also like to say that your baby, if your baby is there in the background, is a very quiet baby. We haven't heard a single peep from the baby, although you had warned us that there might be screaming. There was nothing, so very well done. You're obviously great parents as well as great researchers, so I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to the audience. It's been a fascinating seminar. I've learned a lot about it, so I've really enjoyed it. And can I just remind people in the audience that we will be having other fascinating seminars in our Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Seminar series, and you can find all the details of those on our website. So thank you all, and I wish you all a very good evening.